Hi, I'm Katrina Mikett. I'm one of the co-curators to the show Arms Disposal, now up at Victori Mo Gallery in New York City, and I am joined by one of the 8 artists in the show, Erika Diamond. Erika has made some really powerful works of Kevlar vests that are hanging in the show. There's 3 of them, and I'm here today to learn a little bit more about her and her art process. Hi, Erika. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Katrina. It's an honor and a pleasure. Um, my name is Erika Diamond. I consider myself a textile-focused artist. Um, I was born in Germany, and actually after that, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My parents were ballet dancers, which is why I was there in the first place. So not an army brat, but a ballet brat. Um, Other than that, eventually I went through an arts education. I got my undergrad at Rhode Island School of Design and Sculpture, but definitely found that I had an affinity for textile techniques and sort of maybe didn't know it yet. And eventually, with some time in between, ended up pursuing a master's in textiles at Virginia Commonwealth University. And that's actually where I learned weaving, tapestry weaving. So I do that kind of part time, and then the other work is often garment based.
Mhm, mhm. That's great. You're actually not the only artist in the show that has a tapestry weaving background. That's very interesting. So, did you learn how to sew clothes in school?
No, I guess I learned from a little bit from my mother, and I also I definitely learned kind of out of necessity. Like if there was something I wanted to wear, I just wanted to kind of figure out how to make it myself and choose the fabrics that I wanted. So I enjoyed at a younger age just learning the basics of how to use a sewing machine. And so, um, I thought at one time that maybe I was interested in apparel design, but I'm not really interested in the market around that. Just about being able to use the garment as a sort of means of expression
Yeah.
and a way to show your individuality. So,
I think that's a really interesting inroad to understanding like the fact that you used Kevlar in the show to make wearable garments. I feel like people think of Kevlar as this very industrial, hard to get material, hard to work with material. Um, could you explain a little bit about like where you got it? Was it hard to work with?
sure. Um, I will say that apart from like the sort of deeper impetus to talk about queer safety through this work and the events that led up to me kind of pursuing this particular project of the queer Kevlar vest, I've always been really interested in materials that are related to safety and vulnerability and how they relate to the body or skin. So I guess I'm seeing Kevlar as like a different, like the hardest type of skin. Um, I am super interested in the function of different textiles. So whether I'm looking at tapestry or garments, I'm interested in like why they exist, the sort of history behind them. And so garments are essentially for really two things: comfort and protection.
Mm-hmm.
So Kevlar gives you the most protection. It's heat resistant and cut proof, so that's why it's bulletproof. Um, and it doesn't like physically, it doesn't offer comfort. It's sort of like a plastic material basically, but psychologically, it offers you the comfort of safety. So as a reaction to the Pulse nightclub shooting in particular, um, it's kind of hard to remember the order of events. You know, had I been thinking about Kevlar before? I don't know, but everything just sort of fell into place, and it sort of struck me that like Kevlar might really just become part of our like modern day fashion vernacular. Like maybe we will just all have to wear it.
Yeah, you you mentioned you made the artwork as a response to HB2 and then the Pulse Club shooting.
Yeah.
But we have riots going on right now for 7 days and very aggressive tactics against protesters. And then that's not even getting to the police brutality that had led up to these protests.
Yeah.
It actually doesn't completely change your original intentions of your, not your intentions of your artwork, but there has new context to how
Yeah.
those artworks can be seen now. What do you think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, while these particular vests were made for very specific individuals, I mean, it is intended to speak to the larger question of who gets protected, who gets to be protected. Bulletproof vests are typically worn by people who have authority and power, not necessarily the people who don't have that. So I'm intentionally questioning that. Um, and I think the fact that you don't, when they're in the gallery space, you don't necessarily see a body in them. Maybe that also allows you to see like who you would want to protect or who you think needs to be protected. Um, whoever you are, whoever the viewer is.
Think,
But
do you
no,
think
go ahead.
as you're designing these garments for your friends within the queer community, and they're very specific to their styles, and it's not always very clear that it's Kevlar material. Like there's a shininess to it, but most of us have not seen Kevlar in person, and definitely not in the way that you've presented them. This idea that you mentioned of Kevlar is worn by people with authority and power, and the fact that you're sort of disguising this idea of authority and power in the everyday clothing of the people, um, how do you think that addresses like unequal power dynamics within society?
I think, you know, in a, it's a really great question.
Sorry, I didn't
uh,
try to
yeah,
jump to you with
I mean, it's just, it's been strange to see like a lot of our work, recontextualize itself and like, wondering what the relevance is with so much injustice that has been happening recently. And well, not, just over time. So, I mean, even during the pandemic too, I think that's made us all sort of kind of rethink what we're making and why. Um, I guess what I'm doing with the vests is sort of, instead of focusing on the vulnerability, focusing on the potential for resilience, and allowing like the individual to own that. Like just, maybe you're so vulnerable that you have to wear a bulletproof vest, but there can still be a way for you to maintain who you are. Like you're not just a product of the injustice. You're also a person who contributes to society, who has individual wants and needs and sense of style. And I think for me, it was more about celebrating individual people than focusing on like the tragedy
Yeah.
of a very targeted shooting.
Well, if I could put on my curator hat for a moment,
Yes, please.
I think your work does both. I think it does celebrate the individual, and I do think it highlights unfortunate needs for protection to vulnerable communities. And if we go back to this idea of power within it,
Yeah.
if you're giving power to these communities that don't have it through these vests, but it's disguised behind, this is a different interpretation. Um, but if it's not obvious because it's behind their personal fashion tastes,
Yeah.
that to me also highlights how society is not necessarily ready to give certain communities power, which is going back to one of our earlier conversations as to why we're seeing the protests that we are seeing today.
Absolutely. Um, that makes me want to kind of go back to your earlier question to dig in more about the actual material, which it's not actually hard to find. You can find it online. It's used, hybrid versions of the materials are used to make tires. There are a lot of industry-based applications for it. Typically, you don't see the yellow shiny Kevlar material because it's underneath. It's disguised by this. Usually, it's like a darker color. but you don't see the actual protective material that's stitched inside, which is this Kevlar. Um, it's expensive. So in that way, like it's cost prohibitive. That's another reason. I mean, I had to get a grant to buy my first run of material. It's not something I just, I mean, it's not something I would typically spend. I wouldn't spend that much money on fabric typically for an outfit. So that is interesting to me. Um, there's also, this, when you're working with the material, you actually start to see just how fragile it actually is and how the structure is not very sound. Like it's not like working with wool or cotton where the fibers actually work together and like to stick together. When you cut a piece of Kevlar, it immediately wants to fray and it wants to unweave itself. So the weave structure is actually really tenuous, which in some ways is an interesting parallel and metaphor maybe for our infrastructure and the like it's it can and maybe should easily fall apart
I
when exposed.
Yeah. I have a silly technical question.
Yes, please.
If Kevlar is cut proof,
Yeah.
how do you cut it?
Yeah.
And then how do you sew it?
So no pun intended. It's
Okay.
typically I've like opened this whole world of this particular fabric where I'm learning that there are different thicknesses. So you've got like a ballistic grade, which is what I used for the hoodie. It's a bit thicker, and that is actually, I mean, I can use a pair of Fiskars scissors, and I can cut it. It dulls the blade and it takes forever, but you can absolutely cut through it. And some of the fabric, like the Lisa vest, is a lot thinner. You can use scissors to cut that, but typically when you're wearing a vest, it's layered. So it's the layers of the fabric that really essentially stop the impact. Because it is difficult to cut, it's not impossible. Which I also kind of like knowing. There's a vest I just finished that I actually used a laser cutter to cut out like the pattern pieces, which kind of it singes the edges enough, like if you get the temperature right, so you don't have the fraying problem. It's just so delicate. um,
Interesting.
yeah, but you can work with it. And so working with it on a sewing machine, like sewing through it is not a problem, like because it's got that glossy plasticky feel, the fibers really just sort of move aside.
I would
They
not expect that since it's
Yeah,
supposed to protect you from like a potential stabbing.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So it's really the layering, and so it has this potential to be bulletproof when used effectively. But like it's on its own, it doesn't really it doesn't really, it can't protect you. Like one strand of Kevlar isn't going to protect you. And I've been interested in that too. Like I did one that was I made using a bobbin lace technique, and I was able to find just the Kevlar thread. um, as a lace structure, that's probably not going to protect you, but I'm also questioning, I mean, how much protection, how many walls can we really put up
Mm-hmm.
without allowing you know people to be closer. So I'm also questioning the tactic of putting up boundaries, you know while trying to acknowledge that there are so many people who need protection, who need more protection than they are being offered. um,
That might be a good time to go into the exhibit right now
yeah.
and see the actual vests and to hear a little bit more about the people you intended them for.